Okay, good evening, afternoon, wherever you might be. Welcome to the latest WSET School London webinar. We are very lucky to have Emma Symington MW back with us to talk about Australian Chardonnay. As normal, if you've been to one of these before, it's exactly the same. So Emma's got loads of lovely information about Chardonnay she's going to share with you. If you have any questions as we go along, please do pop them in the Q&A and we'll address those at the end. Otherwise, if you have anything you want to share, you can do so in the chat. We are recording this and the recording will be available normally in a couple of days' time on our YouTube page. So that's about it from me. Over to you, Emma.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Julia. And hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening or this morning or this afternoon, wherever you are in the world. I'm really pleased to be back talking to you again about Australian wine. Some of you might have seen some of the previous sessions I've done with WSET School London. And this one we're focusing on Chardonnay, which feels appropriate given that we're heading into summer here in the UK. Now I can move on. Here we go. So as Julia said, I'm Emma Symington. I am a Master of Wine and I work for Wine Australia. So Wine Australia is the generic body for Australian wine, obviously headquartered out in Australia, but I work for our regional office in London covering the EMEA markets. And I am the education manager for Wine Australia over here. So I get to go out and talk to people about Australian wine all the time, which is not a bad job, I have to say, particularly when I get to talk about Chardonnay, which probably is one of my favourite white grape varieties. Now, before we head into the actual webinar, I just wanted to draw your attention to our education website, which is on the screen here, australianwinediscovered.com. So we created this a couple of years ago, and it's really where all of our educational materials lie. You do have to register to use the site, but it literally takes 2 seconds. And once you've done that, you have freely available all of the information that's on there. So there's information on all the key Australian wine regions, the key grape varieties, sort of bigger topics like old vines and sparkling wines. There's maps, there's video content. Essentially, it's your one-stop shop for anything you could want to know about Australian wine. So particularly for any of you actually studying for your WSET exams at the minute, I would urge you to take a look there because it really would be quite a helpful resource for you. So today we're going to be talking about Chardonnay. So we'll do a quick overview of the history of Chardonnay in Australia, when it started, and how it's changed over time. We'll talk about how it's grown and how it's made, and the different styles of Chardonnay, but then we'll spend most of the session talking about where it's grown in Australia and some of its really key regions and looking at their characteristics and flavour profiles. So that's what we've got ahead of us. But before we skip into that, many of you might have seen this map before, but I always think it's important to show this at the start of every session I do, partly because I love it, but really because I think you can never emphasize enough how big Australia is. And when you're talking about Australia and talking about the variety of styles, be it different grape varieties that are grown in Australia or different styles within a grape variety, as in Chardonnay we're talking about today, when you understand the scale of Australia, it all kind of begins to make a bit more sense. So as it says, Australia is the world's 6th biggest country, and it is, as you can see, bigger than Europe. So just to put a bit of scale on here, if you fly from Perth over in Western Australia across to Sydney, that's about 2,000 miles. It's a 5-hour flight and you'd be crossing 3 time zones. So it's a similar distance from London to Cairo. So always just worth keeping in the back of your mind just how big Australia is, because that scale is so important to beginning to explain the diversity of styles of wines you get in Australia. So unsurprisingly, when you have such a big country, there are a lot of wine regions, 65 in fact, and don't worry, there is no exam today. But as you can see, they're spread, right across the southern part of the country. And that really shouldn't be a surprise that they're all to the southern part of the country, because Australia ultimately is quite a hot country. It's relatively close to the equator. And so, the southern part is much cooler, and made even more cooler because of the emphasis of the Southern Ocean. So the Southern Ocean is a really cold ocean. It sits off the base of Australia, all the waters come up from Antarctica. I'm sure you can imagine there's no land mass between Australia and Antarctica, so this is why the ocean is quite so cold. So it has a really important moderating impact right across this southern part of Australia. So cooling the climate and particularly having very cold ocean breezes that come on shore. So this is why all the regions are really around this southern part of Australia. So 65 wine regions in Australia and 59 of them produce Chardonnay, as we're talking about today. So Chardonnay is a really important grape variety in Australia, the most widely planted white variety by quite a long way. So you might think, when I've just said Australia is a huge country, bigger than Europe, and it has 65 wine regions, which sounds like quite a lot. You might think that it makes quite a lot of wine. But actually, the truth is quite different to that. There's only about 145,000 hectares of vineyard in Australia. Now, again, that might sound like a lot, but that's only about 4% of global plantings. Or to put it another way, it's about the same amount as Bordeaux and Burgundy put together. So if you consider all the vineyards in Bordeaux and Burgundy, and you know how a relatively small area that is, and spread that across Australia, that's sort of how few vineyards there are. So again, it's just sort of understanding that scale of Australia. It is huge, but it doesn't have necessarily as much vineyard area as you might expect. Of course, here in the UK, where I am, we are the #1 export market for Australian wine. So we're the highest in terms of volume and value coming out of Australia these days. So we see a lot of Australian wine here. So I think the perception here in the UK is that Australia produces a lot of wine, and that's just not true. But what it does is export a lot of wine. About 2/3 of all production in Australia is exported. Only about 1/3 is drunk domestically. So this is why I think there is this general idea that Australia produces quite a lot of wine, partly because it's such a big country. But as I just said, the reality is somewhat different. But moving on to Chardonnay, which is what we're here to talk about today. So the first vines actually went out to Australia in 1788. And the first vintage was in 1791. So that was with the first fleet. Those first vines went out. No one's exactly sure when the first vines of the first cuttings of Chardonnay arrived in Australia, but it was sometime in the very early 1800s. So one of those original varieties that came out to Australia. And quite quickly, it sort of found a happy home down under because it really thrived in that warm, dry climate of some of those early wine regions. Now, there's actually in Australia some of the oldest vineyards still producing of Chardonnay today. So there's one that was planted in 1908. So that was the Penfolds Experimental Vineyard. It's actually now owned by Tyrrell's. It's their HVD vineyard. So that was planted in 1908 and believed to be one of the oldest Chardonnay vineyards in the world. But in those old sort of early days of Chardonnay production, most of it was actually blended with other grape varieties into nondescript blends. And it really wasn't until the 1970s that changed. In fact, the first varietal labeled Chardonnay was produced in 1971. It's what, 51 years ago. So not very long at all. And the man that really changed things for Chardonnay in Australia was a man called Murray Tyrrell. So he was a winemaker and owner of Tyrrell's Wines in the Hunter Valley. And he really wanted to make some Chardonnay, but he didn't have any Chardonnay vines. So the legend goes, in the dead of night, one night in the late 1960s, he hopped the fence into Penfolds Experimental Vineyard that I just talked about and took a load of cuttings and then planted them in his own vineyard. That is the legend anyway. And from there, he produced his first vintage in 1971, called it VAT 47 Chardonnay. And that is really where Chardonnay started in Australia as a varietal labelled wine. Then, you know, in the next sort of 10 years or so, more and more people began planting more Chardonnay and labelling it as Chardonnay. And then we get to the 1980s, and this is where things really began to kick off in Australia in terms of Chardonnay. This is really the advent of sunshine in a bottle and these sort of big, bold, rich, ripe, buttery, oaky styles of Chardonnay that's started being produced. And they were styles that really set the world alight globally in terms of export markets. There were styles of Chardonnay no one had ever tasted before, and consumers, particularly here in the UK and in the US, got very excited about. And it's a style that really helped put Australia actually on the global wine map. And people just absolutely love this style of sunshine in a bottle Chardonnay. And that continued through the 80s and into the early 90s. But then, of course, times change, tastes change, and consumers really globally decided they didn't want this style of Chardonnay anymore, and instead turned their attentions to things like Pinot Grigio and Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc. And suddenly, the winemakers realized that nobody wanted this style of sunshine in a bottle Chardonnay that they'd been making. And full kudos to them, because they really changed things around in quite a small, short space of time. So instead of, picking these grapes quite late and making these big, buttery, oaky styles of Chardonnay, they changed things completely and instead started picking much earlier, dialing back on the oak, dialing back on the malolactic fermentation, so not having so much of those buttery flavors coming into the wine, and making quite a different style. Now, it has to be said, I would argue that about 10 or so years ago, that pendulum had swung too far. So they'd started off with this lovely kind of rich, ripe, buttery style of Chardonnay, and they'd almost gone to exactly the opposite extreme. And they ended up, with Chardonnays that often were 11.5 or 12% alcohol, high in acid, quite lean and green and a bit mean, and just not the most, tempting of wines to drink. But I think what's happened in the last 10 years is the winemakers kind of had to go that far to be able to settle the pendulum somewhere nicely in the middle. And now what we see coming out of Australia is Chardonnays tend to still have this lovely ripe core of fruit that is absolutely typical of Australian wine, be it from Chardonnay or anything, but now have this lovely core of acidity running through it, this brightness and freshness, and then some layers of complexity, be it from oak or perhaps some wild fermentation, all sorts of different things. But they're much more restrained than they used to be, but don't have that leanness that they perhaps had 10 years ago. And I really think now Australian Chardonnay is world class. The top wines coming out of Australia are world class in terms of their quality. And what's really great, I think, is their value as well. When we look at places like Burgundy these days, prices are just getting astronomical. They've had a number of short vintages and demand is ever increasing. And prices are just skyrocketing. Normal people like us just cannot afford top Burgundy these days, but we absolutely can afford top Australian Chardonnay. And I would argue the quality is definitely there. So that's where we sit today with Australian Chardonnay. So just briefly talking about how Chardonnay is grown. Now I know this says how Australian Chardonnay is grown, but this is very typical of Chardonnay really anywhere in the world. So Chardonnay is a really adaptable vine, sort of similar in many ways to Riesling, in that it takes on the characteristics of where it's grown, be that in terms of the region it's grown in, or actually the vineyard it's grown in. And I think it's a really interesting grape variety for winemakers and viticulturalists, because they can really start to dig down into their vineyards and different blocks and seeing how different areas perform in different ways. And certainly we're seeing more and more now coming out of Australia of single vineyard Chardonnays, because people are realizing the differences between vineyards that might be very close in proximity, but have quite differences in terms of soil type or water access or so on. It is a grape variety that has the tendency to be highly vigorous. So as a viticulturalist, it is something that needs quite careful management in the vineyard in terms of canopy management, shoot thinning, heavy pruning in the winter, and so on, to manage that vigor. Otherwise, you're going to have a negative impact on flavour quality. It's also a vine that can give quite high yields. Now, of course, in areas in Australia and elsewhere in the world where you're making more, I suppose, entry-level wines, high yields are not a bad thing. But when you're talking premium viticulture to make high quality wine, you really do need to be managing those yields, because obviously lower yields, you're going to be getting higher concentration in terms of flavors in the grapes and more concentration and quality in the wine. So that's another thing to be aware of when you're growing Chardonnay. It is quite an early budding and early ripening grape variety. So in cool climates, issues of frost risk can be a problem, as we've seen many times here in the UK and certainly over in France for the last few years. It's an interesting one in terms of the early ripening, because it very much is an early ripening grape variety. But back in the time of the 80s and 90s, when these big buttery styles of Chardonnay were being produced, it was actually one of the last varieties picked in many vineyards, because they were sort of aiming for that very ripe, very rich, full-bodied style. Now, of course, the opposite is true. It's one of the much earlier grape varieties picked to maintain that freshness and acidity and kind of precision. And then winemaking with Chardonnay. Well, I think Chardonnay is one of those grape varieties winemakers love, because it gives them so many different possibilities in terms of techniques they can use to influence the final style of wine. I've heard it called a chameleon grape variety. I've heard it called the chicken of the wine world. And I think this all just gives you an idea of the adaptability of the grape and the ability to take on different flavors from various different winemaking techniques. So these are just a sort of a snapshot of some of the things that winemakers can consider when they're making Chardonnay in order to give different styles of wines. So whole bunch pressing, so literally, hand picking your grapes and putting a whole bunch in the press, is something that is quite widely used. Obviously has to be used if you're making sparkling wine, but even in still wine, quite often used to decrease the amount of phenolics you're getting into the grapes, and gives you much, much purer juice coming out of the press. Fermentation temperature is absolutely something you need to consider as a winemaker. So if you are fermenting in stainless steel, you can obviously control this. And essentially, cooler ferments, you're going to be keeping more of those esters in the wine, so those really kind of aromatic flavors. If you have a warmer ferment, for example, like you would have if you were fermenting in barrel, you're going to have perhaps less of those aromatics, but more kind of texture and body coming through from a slightly warmer ferment. Malolactic fermentation, of course, a big decision when it comes to Chardonnay, and certainly something that really caused the style of those sunshine in a bottle styles that happened back in the 80s and 90s. Because at the time, most of those wines went through 100% malolactic fermentation, so really softening that acidity. But also it was done in a way to really promote the creation of diacetyl, which is the compound that's produced sometimes during malolactic fermentation, which gives those kind of buttery popcorn kind of flavors. Of course, now people are very much pulling away from that. Having said that, in different wine regions, people will have a bit often of malolactic fermentation to soften some of the acidity, but generally not to get those kind of buttery flavors coming through. Oak influence, of course, is always a big decision for a winemaker, and no more so than with Chardonnay. Of course, firstly, that you have to choose what sort of oak, obviously barriques if you're talking about premium wine, but if you're talking about, higher volume wine, you might be looking at staves or chips. You then need to consider what provenance of oak, French, American, Hungarian, and then what age of oak barrels you're looking at. Obviously, newer oak, you're going to be getting more of those kind of oak flavors coming into the wine. As it gets older, you'll get less and less of that. And then something that's, I think, becoming more prevalent these days in Australia, and not just with Chardonnay, actually, I think across the spectrum of grape varieties, is people now are moving away from barriques, so the traditional 225 litre barrels, towards larger format oak. So things like hogsheads or puncheons, so 300 litre or 500 litre barrels are becoming much, much more common. I think because you get less oak influence, but you still have that effect of aging and maturing in oak. Barrel maturation, as I've just talked about, and then what you do with the lees in barrel. If you keep the wine in contact with the lees And if so, are you doing batonnage? Are you stirring up those lees? Because that's going to give quite a big impact in terms of texture of the wine and body and weight. Wild fermentation, that should probably be on the first slide, but never mind. It's certainly something a lot of people work with, I think particularly with Chardonnay, because you can add in layers of complexity if you're working with indigenous yeast that a lot of people like. But of course, with wild fermentation, there's always that additional risk, because you might have more risk of stuck ferments or more risk of producing off flavors. So it is something that has to be quite carefully managed. And then when you're talking about sparkling wine in terms of Chardonnay, of course, the winemaker has various decisions to make in terms of how long to keep the wine on lees in bottle, what dosage to use, and everything else. So basically what I'm saying is all of this combined means that the winemakers have a huge opportunity to really impact the final style of wine they want to make with Chardonnay, and perhaps more so than with almost any other grape. It really is a grape variety that sort of enjoys having all these different winemaking techniques and works really well with them. And I think these days winemakers understand how to use all these techniques sort of in synergy and not to go over the natural fruit flavors that are coming out of the Chardonnay grape itself. I think what happened back in the 80s and 90s with these sunshine in the bottle wines is that the use of the oak, the use of the malolactic became so dominant in the wine that you couldn't really taste the grape variety at all. What's much more important now for winemakers is being able to tell that it is Chardonnay, but you've got these layers of complexity on top to add interest and appeal. So, common Chardonnay styles. Well, given what I've just said, I think there perhaps is no such thing, because as it says here, it's such an adaptable grape variety that there is no one universal style. And it really is up to the winemaker and what their sort of vision is for the fruit that they get as to what style they want to make. But of course, in Australia, as in really any country that makes Chardonnay, you know, there's some winemakers making unoaked styles of Chardonnay. There's some winemakers making, you know, very oak styles. There are still some sunshine in the bottle style wines made out there. Not many, it has to be said, but there are certain countries in the world where consumers really still enjoy those styles. So they're definitely still being made. So all sorts of options when it comes to styles of Chardonnay, which to me is what makes it such an exciting grape variety. You know, you have this adaptability to the region. So it's a grape variety where you can really see this regional influence coming through, but it's also a grape variety that's in a way adaptable to the winemaker. So you can see the winemaking influence coming through as well. But the big question, where is Chardonnay grown in Australia? Well, as I said earlier, there's 65 wine regions in Australia. 59 of those grow Chardonnay. And we're not going to be here all night, don't worry. I'm not going to be talking through all 59 wine regions. So what I decided to do was talk you through 5 of the key regions for Chardonnay in Australia, one each in each of the key states making wine. So we'll start off by talking about Hunter Valley in New South Wales, as you can see just north of Sydney. We'll then head down to the Yarra Valley, just outside of Melbourne in Victoria. Then we'll talk about probably the hot story, or should I say the cool story of Australian wine these days, which is Tasmania. And then we'll talk about the Adelaide Hills in South Australia, clues in the name there, hills just outside Adelaide. And finally, we'll talk about Margaret River across in Western Australia. So kicking off with the Hunter Valley. So the Hunter Valley is actually a very historic wine region in Australia, one of those very early planted regions back in the early 1800s. It's about 2 hours north of Sydney. So if any of you have visited Sydney, you most likely have probably been out to the Hunter Valley. It's, I think, one of the most visited wine regions in Australia because of its proximity to Sydney. It's also a really beautiful wine region to visit. Now, I've got a few of these maps going through this presentation to show you. So this is our Gaia remote satellite imaging map, which essentially shows you the regional boundaries, that purple line. It also shows you where any official subregions are, which are the orange lines. So you can see there's 3 different subregions here in Hunter. But most interestingly, it shows you where the actual vineyards are. So that is all these kind of dark green blotches in the map. So I think what's interesting here is that you can see Hunter is actually a really big region in terms of scale. It covers a big area, but in terms of plantings, it's actually pretty small. As you can see, there are a few scattered around, but the vast majority are down in this sub-region called Pekolbin, which is actually not too far inland. So that is where most of the vineyards are. Now, the Hunter Valley is an interesting region because I think if you looked at it in terms of its vital climate stats, particularly, it's not really where you would be thinking about planting grapes, and it's really not where you'd be thinking about making premium wine because it's subtropical in temperature. You know, it's hot. In the daytime in the summer in Hunter, 40, 45 degrees quite easily. It is a hot region. It does have a little bit of maritime influence, as you saw on this map, you know, that most of those vineyards are not too far inland. So in the afternoon, you do get some of these breezes coming in off the sea to have a slight cooling impact. But ultimately, it is quite a hot region. And because of that, they do start picking. It's one of the first regions to start picking in Australia. There's not a lot to talk about in terms of altitudes. There's not a huge amount of, you know, cooling influence from altitude here. But what there is that impacts the climate is cloud. And as you can see from this photo, so the Hunter Valley is on the eastern side of the Great Dividing Range, which is the big line of mountains that runs right up the eastern seaboard of Australia. And essentially what that range of mountains does is capture all the cloud cover, and it sits on top of the Hunter Valley, as you can see here. So this is something you see basically every day, every afternoon through the summer, as you get this thick grey cloud. And that has a really important influence because it essentially moderates the climate because it stops so much UV getting through to the grapes. So although it might be hot in the region, there's actually far less UV getting through to the grapes than you might otherwise expect, which means the grapes are not ripening at the same level as you might expect for a region of this kind of temperatures. So the grapes basically aren't getting as ripe as you might expect for, you know, 40, 45 degrees. And this is what gives you this sort of slightly unusual style of wines coming out of Hunter, particularly in terms of Semillon. I know we're not talking about Semillon today, but Semillon in Hunter tends to be slightly earlier picked than it is elsewhere in the world. And because of this cloud cover, it keeps all that acidity in the grapes. So this is why Hunter Semillon tends to be low in alcohol, but high in acidity. And it is this slightly unusual climate that you get in Hunter that causes it. Now, in terms of Chardonnay with Hunter Valley, as I've said, it is quite a warm region, despite this, you know, UV kind of limiting the ripening. So it is a region that does give you a richer, riper style of Chardonnay quite naturally. And that very much is the style of Chardonnay that you have coming out of Hunter. Of course, it is the region, as I said earlier, that really put Chardonnay on the map. You know, this is where Murray Tyrrell went and stole his Chardonnay cuttings and produced VAT 47. And that was then known as the wine that launched 1 million bottles because of its impact on Australian wine generally, but specifically on Chardonnay. But today the wines aren't really made in that sunshine in the bottle style, but still do have this kind of richness and breadth to them because of this slightly warmer climate, particularly compared to some of the cooler climates I'm going to be talking about. So our second region is the Yarra Valley, which is very different to the Hunter Valley. So we've come right down to the bottom of the Great Dividing Range here, into Victoria, just outside of Melbourne. So the Yarra Valley is about, 45-minute drive out of Melbourne, depending on the traffic. Again, it's quite a historic region. It was actually the first region planted in Victoria back in 1838, and did pretty well in those early days and actually exported a fair amount of wine across here to Europe. But by the end of that century and heading into the 20th century, everything declined. there was an economic depression, exports declined because Europe suddenly was producing more wine again after phylloxera hit, and then it was starting to produce wine again. So eventually by the early 1920s, viticulture totally stopped in the Yarra Valley and everyone turned across to dairy and fruit farming instead. And it wasn't until the 1960s, 1970s that vines actually started being replanted. So it's got quite a recent modern history, but it does have this historical side to it too. And quite likely Chardonnay was planted back in those early days, and obviously has been planted more recently too. So again, here we've got this satellite imaging to show you where the vineyards are. And it is a bit different to the Hunter Valley in that I think the vineyards are a bit more kind of spread across the region. And you can see there's also no official subregions in the Yarra Valley. Having said that, there very much are two unofficial subregions that the winemakers regularly refer to, being the Upper Yarra and the Lower Yarra. Now, if you can see on this map, there's a highway that runs from the kind of northeast from Fernshaw, it says on the map, heading down towards the southwest, sort of into Melbourne. So anything south and east of that highway, that is the Upper Yarra. So this is the higher altitude vineyards heading up to 400 plus meters. Anything north or west of that highway is the Lower Yarra. So much lower in altitude, sort of, starting at around 30 meters. So these are much warmer vineyards. So those down in the Lower Yarra, that's where you get things like Cabernet Sauvignon grown, a bit of Shiraz, and also things like Nebbiolo these days. But the Upper Yarra, that's really Chardonnay territory in the Yarra Valley, and used as much for, mostly for still wine, but also for sparkling wine too. There's still a fair amount of sparkling wine made in the Yarra. Again, sort of underlining that cool climate influence of this valley. So it does say on here that the Yarra is continental climate. I'd say there is a fair maritime influence as well. If I go back here, you can see it's really not too far inland, particularly off Port Phillip Bay. So you do get these breezes that come in across the ocean. And because you have this line of hills to the north of Yarra Valley, which is basically the bottom of the Great Dividing Range, that helps keep these cooling influence, these cool air in the valley. So again, that sort of accentuates that cooling influence from the sea breezes. And as I said, there is this quite big variation in altitude across the Yarra Valley. So this is why you have various different grape varieties grown here. But certainly in terms of Chardonnay, those higher vineyards, really, that's where Chardonnay absolutely thrives in the Yarra Valley. That extra cooling influence from altitude, it does really well here. And the Yarra is a beautiful region if you ever get the chance to visit. So as I said, it's surrounded on one side by the Great Dividing Range, and then you've also got another range of hills to the south called the Dandenong Ranges. So it's just surrounded by these hills, and it really is a stunningly beautiful region. So when it comes to Chardonnay coming out of the Yarra Valley, it is definitely a cooler climate area, as I've said, some maritime influence, but also this influence of altitude. So these are much more restrained in terms of style, particularly than, Hunter Valley, much more elegant. Steve Flamsteed, who's the winemaker at Giant Steps, always talks about having a lemon curd element to Yarra Valley. So that citrus element, but that kind of soft citrus, if you see what I mean from lemon curd. Okay, moving on to Tasmania. So Tasmania is often talked about as the next big thing in Australian wine, and it really is Australia's true cold climate. So it's obviously an island. It sits about 150 miles south of the mainland of Australia, and totally surrounded by that Southern Ocean. So the Southern Ocean that I talked about earlier, which is very cold. So Tasmania is really completely bathed in this cold ocean currents, and obviously these winds as well that are coming off the ocean. So very much the coolest part of Australia. In terms of scale, it's about the same size as Switzerland. So to give you an idea in terms of how big it is as an island. But in terms of production, it's actually very small. There's only about 1,700 hectares of vineyard in Tasmania. Now, to put that into perspective, the UK has about 2,500 hectares. So it's an interesting one. I think, we often hear about wines from Tasmania, and particularly when it comes to sparkling wines, but there's actually not a huge amount of vineyard area there. Now, again, there's no official subregions in Tasmania. So Tasmania is the GI, the region. But as you can see on this map, there are these 7 kind of unofficial subregions that the winemakers tend to talk about. So 3 up in the north of Tasmania, then the east coast, and then 3 coming out from Hobart down in the south. But again, looking at the satellite imaging, you can see there's not a huge amount of vineyard area here planted in Tasmania. So climate-wise in Tasmania, it says temperate. I mean, this is, as I said, cold climate. It really is cool. You've got this really important maritime influence, cooling the temperature. So this is absolutely why Tasmania is so well known for sparkling wine, predominantly made from Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and a bit of Pinot Meunier, a traditional method. But it was also known for some really fantastic still wines as well. Again, made from Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, probably the 2 big ones, but there's also some lovely Riesling and some other bits and pieces, Pinot Gris and so on, produced in Tasmania too. I think about 60% of all production is sparkling wine, and about 40% is going for still wine. So just a nice view across Tasmania to show you. And when it comes to style of Chardonnay coming out of Tasmania, to me, Tasmanian Chardonnay always has this real clarity of fruit, this kind of brightness, this kind of crystalline fruit character, and really racy acidity. It's got this bracing line of acidity that runs through it, but lovely fruit and flavour intensity, but very much on that kind of citrus, cool climate angle. So again, quite different to Yarra and quite different to Hunter. As I said earlier, this is a great variety that really shows its regional characteristics. And I think particularly in Tasmania, you're getting that super cool climate style coming through. So for our 4th region, I'll just check the time. We're moving up to the Adelaide Hills. So the clue very much is in the name here. These are hills just outside Adelaide in South Australia. Now, the Adelaide Hills is actually a really big wine region in terms of size. As you can see here, it's about 75 miles north to south and about 20 east to west. But again, as you can see, looking at the satellite imaging, the plantings are quite sparsely planted right through the region. As you can see, there are these 2 official subregions, Piccadilly and Lenswood, and these are the highest part of the Adelaide Hills. Now, although the whole region is called the Adelaide Hills, there is quite a variation in altitude across the region, anything from around about 200, 250 metres up to well over 650 metres. So a really big variation in altitude. But these 2 subregions, Piccadilly and Lenswood, these are the highest parts of the Adelaide Hills, just near Mount Lofty. And that's a 30-minute drive out of Adelaide. So Piccadilly and Lenswood are particularly known for Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Sauvignon Blanc as well. And again, you get some sparkling wine produced there too. Whereas some of the warmer sites in the Adelaide Hills, particularly towards the north, where it's heading up to the Barossa Valley, and also in the east, that's where you get Shiraz, a bit of Cabernet. You also get things like Montepulciano grown. Adelaide Hills is quite an interesting region in terms of alternative grape varieties. There's all sorts of different things planted there. Again, partly because of this variation in altitude and sort of different pockets of climates in different parts of the region. Interestingly, in terms of white grape varieties, it's also a region where Gruner Veltliner seems to be finding a very happy home down under, and there's a group of 25 or so producers now of Gruner Veltliner in the Adelaide Hills, and I think every year they're learning more and more about the grape variety and why it is so well suited to the Adelaide Hills. So one to keep an eye out for. So Adelaide Hills very much is cool climate because of this influence of altitude at those higher sites. It does also have some influence of these breezes coming in across Adelaide from the ocean, but it's certainly not as cool as Yarra, or certainly not as cool as Tasmania. It is that much further north, so it does have a little bit more sunshine intensity because of that. So again, just a view across the Adelaide Hills. This is actually Shaw and Smith's vineyard in Lenswood, for any of you who know their wines. This is just outside their winery. So in terms of style of Chardonnay coming out of the Adelaide Hills, it is cool climate, so it has got this elegance to it, but it's not as lean or restrained, particularly as wines you get out of, for example, the Yarra Valley or Tasmania. But equally, it's not as ripe as you get from, say, the Hunter Valley or Margaret River that we're going to talk about next. So it's kind of it occupies that sort of happy medium, I suppose, between those two kind of contrasting styles, between the super cool climate and the warmer climate style. So it always has this elegance. To me, you kind of tend to get a peach core, those kind of peachy fruit in the Adelaide Hills, as opposed to that kind of more citrusy fruit that you get in those cooler climates, so Yarra Valley or Tasmania. And then finally, we're going to head right across to the west part of Australia, Western Australia, to Margaret River. So again, we started in Hunter Valley, just north of Sydney. So now we're in Margaret River, just south of Perth. So this is about 3,200 kilometres, I think it is. In terms of distance we've just travelled, so a long way. So unsurprisingly, they make quite different styles of Chardonnay. So the Margaret River is 3 hours south of Perth. As you can see, it is a peninsula, so it's surrounded on three sides by the ocean. So the southern side of Margaret River is that cold Southern Ocean I've been talking about, but the western and the northern side of Margaret River is the Indian Ocean. Now, the Indian Ocean is a warm ocean, so it has quite a different influence in terms of climate than that cold Southern Ocean. And as well, because you have this kind of confluence of these two oceans where they join, it also pushes up big ocean currents. So Margaret River, as well as being known for its wine, is also very well known for its big waves and its surfing. So if you ever get the chance to go out there, you'll most likely find that the winemakers are also very keen surfers. The classic surf in the morning and then come in and make wine. It's a lovely place to visit. So Margaret River, in terms of plantings, it's actually quite large in terms of plantings, perhaps compared to some of the regions we've just been talking about. There's about 5,000 hectares of plantings, but as you can see, quite nicely sprinkled down the region. The northern part of Margaret River is a bit warmer and the southern part is a bit cooler, particularly because of that influence of the Southern Ocean. But in general, Margaret River is actually known as a biodiversity hotspot. It's been internationally recognised as such, one of, I think, 36 in the world. There's something like 8,000 different plant species endemic to Margaret River, so only found there. And this sort of kind of natural perspective and biodiversity is a really important part of the story of Margaret River, alongside the ocean, because those two things together, I think, really define what Margaret River is and how it feels when you go and visit it. So as I said, with it being a peninsula, you've got the ocean on three sides. And this Indian Ocean on the west and the north essentially acts to give the region quite a low diurnal variation. So it never gets very hot in Margaret River in the summer. You'd be looking at kind of 30, 35 degrees max. It's really pleasant. It's a lovely place to visit. But the temperature also doesn't drop very much at night because of this influence of the ocean. And what that means is these grapes can ripen a little bit later than they might be able to in a region like Mornington Peninsula, for example, which is another peninsula in Victoria, just south of Melbourne, and that's surrounded on three sides by the Southern Ocean. So that has a bigger diurnal variation than you get here in Margaret River. So you have in Margaret River this sort of lengthened ripening time every day, albeit it's never that hot in the daytime. And to me, this gives to any Margaret River wine, be it white or red, this lovely kind of plushness of fruit to its core that I just associate with this kind of long, slow ripening that you get every day. Now, the other important influence in terms of the coast in Margaret River is something called the Lewin Current. So the Lewin Current runs from north to south down the coast, and it's a warm current because it's pulling that warm water from the Indian Ocean down the coast. And it runs basically through the winter. So it has an important influence in terms of moderating the climate through the winter, moderating things like frost risk. So you never get any frost risk in Margaret River. And it means the winters are kind of, again, lovely and pleasant and mild. It's a beautiful place to visit. But what you find in the summer is that current actually pushes out to the west, so away from the coast. And this allows the waters from the Southern Ocean to come much further north up the coast. So this has that cooling influence. And you feel it in the vineyards. So if you're out in the vineyards in the summer, in the afternoon, you get this breeze that comes through. And it's cool. It's a cool breeze, so much so that the locals actually call it their air conditioner, their natural air conditioner, because it comes through every afternoon through the summer. So again, although you've got these lovely kind of pleasantly warm summer days, you also have this cooling breeze that kind of drops the temperature around the grapes. So again, slowing that ripening time and lengthening out the growing season. And again, it's part of what makes Margaret River a very special place to grow grapes. So as I've just described, Margaret River really has a Mediterranean climate with this very strong maritime influence. In terms of altitude, there's not a lot to really talk about in Margaret River. You know, it gets up to about 150 meters. But what is important is this altitude is actually a ridge that runs north to south down the center of the region. So any vineyards on the eastern side of this ridge, so away from the coast, are actually warmer because they don't get the influence of these ocean breezes. That ridge stops it. So this is where people in Margaret River are planting things like Shiraz and also some alternative grape varieties, Tempranillo and all sorts of different things in some of these slightly warmer sites are growing quite nicely. Now, when it comes to Chardonnay in Margaret River, there's one other thing to talk about, which is this heritage clone, called the Gingin clone. And this is something that is very specific to Margaret River and helps give Margaret River its sort of style, its characteristics of Chardonnay. So as I said, Gingin clone is a heritage clone to the region. It was originally imported, we think, probably from California, from UC Davis back in the early 1900s, and was then planted in a town called Gingin, just north of Perth, hence the name. Now, Margaret River is quite a young region. It was originally planted back in the 1960s, and the first Chardonnay there wasn't planted until 1975. And for those plantings, they took cuttings from this Gingin vineyard, and that therefore this clone was called the Gingin clone. And that's really what started Chardonnay in Margaret River. Now, as you can see, the Gingin clone has a very specific style or typology, which it has millerandage, as you can see here, or hen and chicken. And what that means is you have these very, very big grapes, as you can see here on the right-hand side. So this tends to give the wine, you know, lots of ripeness and fruitiness and juiciness, whereas it also has these tiny little grapes, as you can see, particularly on the left picture here. So these kind of very, very small, almost peppercorn-sized grapes. These tend to be very high in acidity, but as well, because these grapes have a very high skin to juice ratio, you get more phenolics out of these grapes. And this is why Margaret River Chardonnay always has this lovely ripe core, partly down to that climate I was talking about, but partly down to this Gingin clone with those big grapes. But it also always has this beautiful line of acidity running through it, that's coming from these smaller berries. And then it also has this texture. Now, Virginia Wilcock, who's the winemaker at Vas Felix, she's described it as having an al dente texture. So if you imagine biting into, you know, a pasta, but cooked in a, you know, a really, really good Italian restaurant with that al dente kind of bite. That's what she's describing when she's talking about this texture in that comes from Gingin clone in Margaret River. Now, for anyone wondering, a while ago, people used to think Gingin was the same as Mendoza clone, which you may have heard of. But recent genetic research has found they're actually two very distinct clones, and as distinct from each other as from any other clone of Chardonnay. They just both share this characteristic of hen and chicken. So this is a lovely view across the Margaret River coastline. Again, it's a stunningly beautiful region to visit and absolutely defined by the ocean. But in terms of Chardonnay, in terms of Chardonnay characteristics and style, it's what I've just been discussing. You know, Margaret River Chardonnay always has this breadth and this kind of ripeness to its core, but then this lovely line of acidity just keeps it super fresh and long. And then that texture that surrounds it, which is very typical to Margaret River. And I just think it does come from this Gingin clone, which is still by far and away the most widely planted clone in Margaret River. There is a little bit of some Dijon clones planted there as well, but most people would absolutely agree that it is Gingin clone that gives Margaret River Chardonnay its style, its characteristics, its typicity. Right, and that's kind of really everything I wanted to cover in terms of Chardonnay. So just to recap, if you want to learn anything more about Australian wine, please head to australianwinediscovered.com or ping me an email. My email was at the beginning of the slideshow. I'm always happy to hear from anyone. So does anyone have any questions?
Thanks so much, Emma. That has been a really interesting look at all the guises of Chardonnay and the different places to find it. Yeah, we've got time for questions now. So there's a couple that have popped up in the chat so far. The first one says, can you explain how whole bunch pressing leads to a purer Chardonnay? I've heard this before, but can't figure out how whole bunches lead to greater purity. Thank you.
It's essentially to do with the stalks and the stems which are in with the fruit. It allows for more drainage channels through, so the juice gets out very much quicker from the press. So this is why you have lower levels of phenolics, particularly in the juice, and that's why it's described as a purer juice, because it's just kind of the fruit and the aromatics without that phenolic content.
Lovely, thank you. Couple of other questions we've got. Hannah asks, are there any regions in Australia that are making very reductive styles of Chardonnay, a bit like some of the New Zealand styles?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that's a real winemaking decision more than a regional decision, I would say. Having said that, there's some regions where you do see more of it typically. I think the Yarra in particular, you tend to see more of that kind of struck match character coming through. Whereas regions like Margaret River, because you've got that slightly richer style, you tend not to see the reductive style, that struck match character. So yeah, more of those cool climates. But I think it's something that we saw quite a lot of about 5 years ago, maybe 7 years ago. And again, it was just the story of the winemakers experimenting with different styles and figuring out what they wanted to get out of Chardonnay. And I think many people have pulled back actually on the amount of reduction you see, because again, they just want the fruit to shine through and the layers of complexity to sit above that, but not be masking the fruit.
Excellent, thank you. A question here, apart from Margaret River, has any other region experimented with other clones to any significant degree?
Good question. I think Gingin and Margaret River are just two things that really go hand in hand. And as I said, some people there are experimenting with other clones, although in general, it does seem like Gingin performs the best in the region. In other regions, I think most people are planting a mix of Dijon, there's some Penfolds clone and various other things, but there's not necessarily that link between clone and region as there has been in Margaret River. And I think partly that's just because Margaret River is quite a new region and, it's really isolated. you've got to really want to go there. And so when they were doing those original plantings, they didn't have much option in terms of what they could plant. And it just happened that Gin clone was the one that was available, but it's really well suited to the region. So they did get very lucky in that sense.
Great stuff. Thank you. Another question here from Claire. Can you recommend any produce to try?
Oh, so many. Where do I start? Okay. How about I give you one from each of the regions I've just discussed, because I mean, honestly, otherwise the list would be as long as my arm. But starting in Hunter Valley, I mean, you really must try Tyrrell's VAT 47. As I said, it really is the wine that puts Australian Chardonnay on the map, but it is just a beautiful wine. Not as rich and ripe as it used to be once upon a time, but it is absolutely classic of Hunter Valley Chardonnay. When it comes to Yarra Valley, I mean, I love the wines from Mac Forbes or Giant Steps, who I briefly mentioned earlier. Either of those, but there's so many great producers in Yarra Valley. Tasmania, I mean, you know, the big one, the best well known probably is Tolpuddle, but getting pretty expensive these days. For something a little bit more kind of weekend style versus special occasion, Stargazer, really brilliant small producer down in the southern part of Tasmania, well worth seeking out. Adelaide Hills, Shaw & Smith M3 Chardonnay for me is an absolute banker. You know, it's what, 25 quid these days, but it is really incredible value for that, and a beautiful, beautiful wine. And then across in Margaret River, I mean, if you've got the money, Lewin Art Series is the one to go for. But again, it's not really your everyday wine. Oh, but you can't really go wrong with Margaret River Chardonnay. The nice thing about Margaret River is it's basically all small producers, and they all know what they're doing. But Vas Felix probably is as good as any, and you can really work up the scale there. They've got three different Chardonnays at various price points, and they're all delicious. So I hope that helps.
Sounds like a great list. Yeah. I think we've probably got time for one more question, if that's okay with you. David has asked, how is the evolving climate affecting Australia, and perhaps more specifically the examples you've given today?
Oh, great question. I mean, climate change is top of everyone's mind, I think, in Australia, but, you know, globally, really, with viticulture. In terms of the regions I've mentioned today, well, places like Yarra Valley, for example, people are planting ever higher. So I think that is definitely one way to be combating climate change in those kind of regions, you know, just keep planting a bit higher. But as well, it's giving them the opportunity to rethink what is planted in those lower vineyards. And obviously Chardonnay is not great in the lower vineyards in Yarra Valley. So now they're planting other predominantly red grape varieties, but also experimenting with things like Grenache and Shiraz and Nebbiolo, and some of those grape varieties that probably weren't planted there originally. So that is definitely part of the story. And of course, alternative varieties is absolutely part of the story of how people are kind of beginning to deal with climate change, because a lot of these Mediterranean varieties don't need as much water, in particularly as things like Cabernet Sauvignon, also Shiraz and Chardonnay. So some of those Mediterranean, Italian, you know, Southern Italian and Spanish grape varieties are becoming much more popular in some of the warmer regions, and perhaps not so much the regions I've talked about today, but in places like McLaren Vale, Barossa Valley, and so on. I think there's a real interest in some of these alternative grape varieties and what they can give to Australia.
Excellent. Thanks very much. Well, I think that takes us to time then, really. So thanks again for the great presentation and for answering those questions.
Not a problem at all.
I'm sure you'll be back again soon. Well, I hope you'll be back again soon. And we can do some more webinars. It's been really great. And thank you to everyone for attending as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for attending, everyone. And if there is anything you'd like to hear me talking about from Australia, maybe drop me or Julia a line, because it would be good to know what you'd like to learn more about. But absolutely, thank you for joining us tonight, and I hope you will enjoy some Australian Chardonnay soon.